is that at HBHMS, you all are really doing the work that engages with community and supporting and lifting up leaders who are working to make our communities better. And I think that we share, we're kindred spirits in that regard. I'm reminded time and time again of my existence being very much tied to community. Um, when I was born and raised, when I was born into the Black church. I was raised in the Black church. And I say the Black church because the Black church has specific role and function when it comes to faith and social justice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, I was made to feel from the very earliest of days that I belonged to community, that I had value, that I had worth, because those women, those men in the church, they lifted me up. They told me that I was somebody and that I had value. I delivered my first speech when I was 7 years old. Now, it wasn't my speech. I recited, I should say, it was a recitation, reciting of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. A portion. It wasn't the entire 17 minutes, it was just a portion. But I got my start, my oratorical, engagement in the church, speaking about justice at the age of 7 years of age. Having parents who were very much centered on justice work. My father was a faith and civil rights leader. My father, his mantra was freedom is the ability to say no to a lie, to veto an untruth. He would say that the preacher is the freest person on earth because the preacher's allegiance is to the cross and not the flag. Well, when you grow up in a household like conversations about justice are more frequent than conversations about what we're having for dinner. And then my mother, as some of you may have come to know her through some work she's been blessed to do with you all, she taught us from a very early age that justice work is present or can be present in just about everything you do. So her first job was as a art therapist for people who were addicted, suffering from substance abuse addiction. And she engaged in art therapy with them. And she was centered very much on giving them voice through their art, helping them to find themselves, helping them to see their struggles as opportunities to share with the world, what they were going through and why it was significant and what they would overcome, what they were overcoming. And so I grew up in this household where it was all about lifting up, saving, serving, and protecting not just yourself, but everybody, doing the work that Jesus did, that Jesus modeled for us, that God purposed us to do. So the interesting thing for me is that I went off to college, had no idea what I wanted to do or be. I actually thought I might be a doctor or a chemist, so I studied chemistry. And then in my last year of college, realized I didn't want to be a chemist, didn't want to be a physician. Um, my uncle was an attorney, one of my uncles, and he said to me when I was telling him I didn't know what I wanted to do or be, he said, "Go to law school, and while you're there, you'll figure it out." And then he went on and he said, "And that's okay if you don't, because people think that lawyers can do anything short of practicing medicine." He was right. People really do believe that. I think that's in part why I've been so privileged to do so many things throughout the course of my career. But what he was most right about was that when I went to law school, I'd discover it, I'd figure it out. And when I was in law school, searching for a law review note topic, I happened upon a case of a young man who'd been tried and convicted for the murder of his father. And at sentencing, instead of the judge saying that he belonged in prison, she said he belonged in a mental health facility because the defense had demonstrated that he had suffered years and years and years of post traumatic stress syndrome. He'd been severely, mentally, emotionally, and physically abused by his father, so much that the circumstances under which he killed his father did not look to the average person like they were, in response to like his life being at risk. But because he'd been abused so much, he felt like his life was always in danger. And all of a sudden, like the world opened up for me. And I realized that while I had some knowledge of abuse and neglect, I did not understand that we live in a society where so many people's challenges and traumas go unnoticed and go unchecked, and that can cause people to do things they otherwise might not do. I didn't realize that children could suffer abuse and neglect at the hands of their parents so severe that they would live feeling that they were constantly at risk of losing their lives. That opened up a whole new world for me. And I'll never forget while I was going back and forth deciding whether or not I was going to go into corporate law, one day hearing God speak to me and say, I want you to help take care of my children made vulnerable in this society. And I realized that God was calling me to do a certain thing. That was back in 1993, 92. And now, I guess we're now, 31 years later. I've never looked back. God ordered my steps. I thank God that I had the clarity in the moment to hear God speak to me, and I started doing the work. And here's what happened. I realized as I was doing the work that sometimes, like the programs, the policies that are put in place to help people who've been made vulnerable, help them in the moment, but they don't help them for a lifetime. I also realized that very often, sometimes we've got people who are benefiting from a certain policy or program, but they may be in the minority. And not everybody who's in need or who is challenged is getting the services that they need, that they justly deserve. And I began to appreciate that the work has to occur not just at the program level, but at the systems level. So I began doing more and more work in policy. And then I began to appreciate that policy work, while good, is very often a band aid response to a structural, foundational problem. Here's what I mean by that. If we are trying to, um, if we're trying to make sure that everybody has food to eat by standing up in our churches and in our faith institutions, food pantries and soup kitchens, that is good. That is good work, but it's of the moment. Feeding somebody for a day, but not changing the system that makes it necessary for them to even go to a food pantry is what need be done. Charity versus justice work. And I begin to realize and appreciate that so much of the program offerings and so much of the policies that that attend at the local level, the municipal level, at the state level, the federal level, are all centered on perpetuating need and deprivation and responding in charitable ways at best, even philanthropy. Those who benefit most are most in from systems that are unjust are intent on continuing to stand up. Charitable activities. I begin to realize that the work that needed to happen was more of the structural change, the justice work, right? When the Bible says that God, like that that we shall exalt, that God shall exalt, and the mountains will be leveled and the valleys, right? What he's speaking about is we got to do justice work here. We got to bring those high up down and elevate those who've been in need. Justice work. And so that's what I've been about for, like, goodness, I guess now the last 10 years, 12 years or so. And God has ordered my steps. He has made possible the work that I do. Interestingly, some of you may appreciate with Dr. Hagray leaning in, and you may remember I was afforded the opportunity to come and speak at the conference. Goodness, I don't remember. Maybe it was before COVID. It was maybe 2018, 2019.
Yes, 2018 Space for Grace.
2018. Thank you. See, that's why I need my friend to keep my memory when I don't have it, or to help me recall. I came and I talked about my journey being diagnosed with leukemia, and learning that I, with chemotherapy, we could treat the cancer, but I needed a transplant to actually be cured of it, to not be in need of it ever again, of chemotherapy. That the chemotherapy would treat it, but the cancer would likely come back. And at some point, the cancer would probably kill me. If I had a transplant, a bone marrow transplant, I would be cured. I had a broken chromosome due to an environmentally caused leukemia, and it rendered my blood and bone marrow system defunct. Cancer that was likely to return because it was a blood and bone marrow problem. And your blood and your bone marrow are what help fight off cancer. I had this problem. I needed a new system. I didn't just need chemo because the chemo would prove ineffective over time. I needed a new blood and bone marrow system. Why am I sharing that in this moment? For two reasons. One, because in order to receive a bone marrow transplant, I needed a donor. I needed someone of similar genetic typing. I needed someone likely of African heritage and descent. I needed my community. I needed my community to take care of me. What I learned from that journey when I came on through, that community is equipped to take care of community, but community has to step up and do the work. The other thing that I learned was that the treatment, as I just said, would only last for a short while. The chemotherapy would work for just as I'm certain, but the transplant would reset my blood and bone marrow system, give me a new foundation, a new structure. And what I realized is God was helping me to appreciate that just like I needed a cure, a new foundation, treatment was not enough. That is analogous to the work that we are continually doing when we center just on policies and programs to help people who've been made vulnerable. They help in the moment. They help address the problem in the moment, but they do not cure people of the problem. So when we look at people who are impoverished and we set up food pantries and soup kitchens and we make sure they have housing subsidies and childcare subsidies, critically important, no doubt. No child, no individual should go to bed hungry at night. Critically important. But if we're not doing the foundational structural change work, then we're just allowing in this nation, in this society, structural economic deprivation to persist. Justice work is tearing down, dismantling the structures that make food supports, that make housing subsidies necessary in the first place. And so that's the work that I've been blessed and I've been privileged to center on. What does justice work look like for me? Well, it looks like, everything from changing the rules, as I was blessed to do, to end solitary confinement in New York City for all persons who are detained in our New York City jails. Not just saying, oh, well, let's increase the time that people, are taken out of isolation. No, let's end solitary confinement because it's torture. The United Nations has deemed it, declared it so. We can find ways of addressing the harms that people who've been put in solitary confinement, sometimes the violence that they engage in. We can address that, but we don't have to break their minds. Justice work for me looks like in the present day, and Dr. Hagre knows some of this work because I'm always talking about it on social media. Justice work today looks like for me going and to our nation and getting our nation to change the way that we measure need in America. America, for far too long, has centered on acute deprivation when it comes to measuring what people need to live, to get by day to day, and to plan for tomorrow. We have an official poverty measure in this nation. It is the standard by which we set wages and by which we set eligibility for critical income supports. And that measure today says that a family of four living anywhere in the nation needs just $30,000 to not be poor. Two adults, two children needs just $30,000 to not be poor. What does that measure do? It justifies a federal minimum wage of $7.25 today. Because when $7.25 is annualized, that's $15,000 annually. Two adults working full time at federal minimum wage, $30,000. And with two children, they're not poor. And then what does the federal government do? And the states and the municipalities follow suit. They make the eligibility determinations for food supports, for childcare subsidies, housing subsidies, transportation subsidies, even Medicaid on that official poverty measure. Sometimes they look at other factors, but that is their core. So if you are essentially discounting and minimizing what people need to not be poor, technically poor, as a society, you're upholding structural economic deprivation. And here's what that looks like. In order to be eligible for critical income supports, what the federal government, the state government, the local government does is look at how much you have in assets, savings. If you have more than $500 in savings, you are less eligible for housing subsidy, food subsidy. The federal government, the state government, local governments are saying that the lowest income people can't even have savings of a significant amount. The key to economic security is having a modicum of savings to plan for a rainy day, to plan for retirement, to plan for your future and your children's futures. So, what we have in America right now is government sponsored and sanctioned structural economic deprivation that ensures that low income people will never get ahead. Here's the crazy thing, it's now also upholding structural economic deprivation for middle class Americans. People who have as much as who are at the level of 500% of poverty, family of four, $150,000, increasingly are saying they're comfortable, they've got a roof over their heads, they've got food, but they're worried about tomorrow. 46% of all Americans, whatever your income, 46% of Americans do not have more than $500 in savings. That is structural economic deprivation that ensures that those who have will continue to have, and those who do not will have a very hard time getting ahead. So I'm now doing the justice work of advancing at the national level a true cost of living measure that requires our federal government, states, and localities to calculate just the official poverty measure that focuses again on basic needs and acute deprivation, but what Americans need, county by county, to not only survive, but to thrive, to live with dignity, to get ahead. That's justice work. Yes, Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. Some people use that. Some people interpret that scripture to mean, well, it was just it was an acceptance that some people will forever be in need. What Jesus was really doing was referring to the Torah and our responsibility for us to do the work of making sure they go without. And part of doing the work is justice work. Last thing I'll say here, I sat on a panel. Uh, oh goodness, I guess shortly after COVID, like kind of ended, we were out and we were about again. It was a panel at the Union Theological Seminary, and we were talking about um, charity and justice work. And there was a priest who was on the panel with me, and he said some words that I'll show. I want to always be holding at the forefront of my thinking. He said, "What if doing charity work is a sin?" God was a revolutionary. Jesus was a revolutionary. Jesus was turning upside down the temple tables, right? He was speaking truth to what was perceived as power. He wasn't just doing charity work. He just wasn't feeding the masses. He was doing justice work. What if doing charity work alone is a sin? We've got to be doing the justice work. And I'm just ever thankful to God that, as people would say, he thought I could handle this. It ain't easy. And with Justice work, you don't get to see your results that you would desire overnight, but you do get to see God working. I get to see God working when I'm called to a platform in a community such as yours to be able to talk about this work, to share the little bit of my experience and learn from you all and be strengthened by it. So that's kind of who I am. It's what I do. It's what I'm grateful for. And I realize that every bit of my experience along the way, the good, the bad, the challenging, has purposed me and strengthened me for this moment.
Grateful. Jennifer, I you may take a moment and see the comments in the chat, just offer in consideration of what you have offered. Uh, I saw Moya Harris. I saw the clap of your hands in agreement. And so what we want to do in this moment is give so you can come off mute and offer your questions or your comments to some or all of what Jennifer has shared. I can open with a question, but I'm just going to wait a moment and give someone else a space to offer a comment, a brief comment, a brief question, if you could, a pointed question, if it is a question, to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Sure, Lisa, I'd like to be the first to jump in here with a comment and a question. The comment is simply to say thank you to Jennifer Jones Austin for all of the work that you do. I do follow her actively on social media. She's all over the country all the time, changing systems. And to that point, I really appreciate what you said about charity and justice, and you were making a distinction. And because we as people in the church are so often engaged in acts of charity, feeding and clothing and those kinds of things. I just want to ask you to, if you can be more explicit about the distinction between justice and charity. It sounds like justice is more the policy systems, charity is more, but I'd like to hear in your that distinction that you're making if you would flesh that out a little more.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, um, what I first want to make sure that people have a full appreciation of is the fact that it's not that I believe that charity work is unnecessary or it's immaterial, that it's not significant. It has value. It has purpose. You know, as we seek to change systems and structures, we can't do so without making sure that people have what they need in the moment. So never, never, never think that I believe that charity work is not important. But what has happened in our society is that we've adopted, um, I'm just going to put it out here. Okay, now I'm going to take us way, 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 way back. If we go back to the days of slavery, the slave masters made sure that, you know, the enslaved persons were fed, right? So they could get back out there and work the fields, right? They made sure that they had enough wood to burn so that they would be warm when they slept at night so they could get back out there. But they didn't pay them fair and equitable wages so that they could take care of these families could take care of themselves and be independent and economically secure. They kept them dependent and reliant on the system that they had structured. Charity work, in many ways, has taken on that form with a government that does not see what it costs for people to live on a daily basis and to get ahead. And so when we have, you know, philanthropic institutions, and dare I just call it, many of which were founded by people and institutions that benefited from an unjust capitalist structure, you know, when the great majority of them allocate funds mainly for the purpose of charity work and less for structural change, changing the policies. Yeah, I'll give you a really, really good example. One of the largest hedge funded um, philanthropic institutions in the nation raises at a gala one night $25 million. When we reached out and asked this institution to fund our national campaign to create a true cost of living measure, the response that we were given was, oh, sorry, we can't do that. We don't have the bandwidth. We weren't asking you for staff. We weren't asking them to take on any particular aspect of the work. Just give us a grant. But they understood, I guess to their credit, they couldn't go back to their board and said, this institution wants money to disrupt and upend a poverty measure that keeps people in a state of deprivation. They're trying to change the conversation about what it truly costs to live. If we change the conversation about what it truly costs to live, that has an impact on policies related to housing, childcare, food supports, transportation, childcare. Also has an impact on how we talk about what is a fair and livable wage. They didn't have the bandwidth. So justice work, structural work, systems work is changing the foundational laws and the systems that have been advanced by these laws that enable the deprivation to continue. And nobody's the wiser for it. The charitable work is not addressing the systems, the policies, the laws themselves, and just saying, well, let's just see how we can get some more food on the table. Let me see, what's another example? Another example is when we talk about wage parity for women, and particularly women of color. And we talk about, oh, well, let's make sure they have more greater access to college as a means to growing their income. But we don't look at how, in order to attain a college degree, very often they amass great student debt. We don't look at how, for many women, Black women in particular, it takes them receiving a master's degree before they earn as much as a white man with a high school diploma. If we just say go to college, and now they've got more student debt, and their wages haven't increased significantly, and because of a variety of other issues, they are the primary breadwinners in nearly 70% of households. We know that we're allowing structural economic deprivation to persist and allowing for their children, 1 in 3 Black children, to live in poverty compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. So the work has to be done to upend occupational segregation. Not just, oh, go to college. Let me give you a scholarship just to go to college. Because you'll still be relegated, often for Black women, to jobs that pay less. And even when you get into professions that would pay more, we see that the wages go down. So the work has to be a both and, but it's really looking at how do these systems perpetuate economic deprivation. One of the projects that I'm leaning into right now, Dr. Hagrate, that I've got my team building out here at FPWA, is work that centers on the barriers to growing wealth. Here's what structural change looks like. We live in a society where when we talk about wealth for low income persons and families, and even middle income Americans, it's almost like it's a bad word. Like to say that let lower income persons should have an opportunity to build wealth. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, why should they get to build wealth when we have to give them food supports? Because the only way that you achieve economic security and you change your situation in America is to have a little bit of wealth. You don't have to have Bezos's wealth. You don't have to have what was Rockefeller wealth, but enough money to weather a storm. When lower income families go through a storm, they have to decide. The car breaks down. Am I going to get the car fixed? or am I going to shortchange? If I do so, I got to shortchange my children on food tonight and tomorrow. People who have a little bit of wealth don't have to make those decisions. But we live in a society that creates barriers to wealth attainment for people with lesser incomes. So we're now doing the justice work of looking at what that is in the form of tax policy, how we set wages, how we determine, the relationship between assets and income supports, what we do around occupation segregation, barriers to building wealth. So that's structural. It's looking at the laws and the foundations that uphold deprivation.
Thank you. Jennifer, there's a question in the chat. Pastor Terrence Porter listed a question. Pastor Porter, you want to come off and vocalize your question?
Yeah, greeting. Thank you. Outstanding discussion, Ms. Austin. The question that I had was on a local level. How would you encourage the church, the body of Christ locally to engage in justice work? And what would you suggest as far as would be the steps to get started, if you will?
Appreciate that question, and it's something that I am actively working out. So I'll begin by saying helping local churches to appreciate that. Again, I go back to Jesus was a revolutionary. That Jesus was not just about charity work. Very often, there are churches who say, well, no, 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 we're not getting involved in politics. We stay away from that. And I'm just going to tell you, sometimes it is difficult for churches to get involved in politics, to get involved in policy and justice work because they receive a lot of government funding. And as Dr. Hadley knows, my dad used to say all the time, be careful when you sit at the table and eat Caesar's meat. You can't be, like eating Caesar's meat and then talking trash about Caesar because Caesar's going to cut off your hand and keep you from the table. So you have to be very careful when you begin receiving government funds because sometimes when receiving government funds, your tongue not only gets tied, it actually gets clipped. So understanding, helping people to understand first and foremost that justice work is Jesus' work is critically important and rooting it in scripture. And then helping people to understand what this looks like, what it has looked like since the beginning of the founding of this nation, the taking of land from Native Americans, the birthing of slavery, and essentially, in slave masters who themselves were Christians, essentially teaching a gospel that, made God complicit, a co-conspirator in structural injustice. That, essentially, essentially said that God is on board with a system and a structure that says some people are entitled and others are not. So the work begins with unpacking and unraveling all of this so that we are level setting and we're helping people understand that the scripture teaches us that the structures and the systems that prevail right now are not what God desired, teaching us all to be Amoses, to call out the injustices. And then the work begins of looking at what that looks like at the national, state, and the local levels. What are the things that are being done to uphold inequity, to uphold poverty, to uphold disparity? Here's a great example that I'll give you. I have a good friend. His name is Dr. Frederick Haynes. He is the pastor of the Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. He called me one night. Oh goodness, I'm going back to maybe it might have been like January or December of last year. And he told me he was down in Florida, and he said that he was marching with pastors in Florida who were demonstrating, protesting the governor's plan to remove the teaching of Black history and banning Black books from public schools in Florida. And so he told me he was down there and they were engaging on that work. If you talk to him, if he was on this call, he said that I took his head off. Now, do I look like somebody who would take somebody's head off? Do I sound like that? What I said to my friend was, I hear you, but I'm not really moved by this. Because when, are you ready? 8% of Black students, graduating eighth grade in Florida, only 8% are math proficient, when less than 15% are reading proficient. You know, I can make sure my kids have Black books, but what you need to be doing is taking the system on for not educating these children. What good is a book in the classroom if the kids don't even know how to read it? They can't read it. Justice work is getting to the core. It's when government wants you to do, it's kind of like the okey doke or the 3-card Monty. So Pastor Porter, it's making sure that our churches understand that, yeah, okay, we can fight about the banning of Black books, but what we really need to be doing is taking on the systems that are allowing our children to not be educated properly. When $23 billion today, what are we talking about? 70 years after the after the law of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision, when still today, $23 billion less in funding for education is the case in predominantly Black communities than white communities. The justice work is dismantling those laws that allow for significantly lesser funding. So it's teaching, faith-based, theologically based, the importance of justice work, the necessity for it. And then it's the work of the education of what that actually looks like so that people can understand what they have to battle. And then it's mobilizing and organizing to do the work and thinking about the strategies. A lot more needs to be said, but that's oversimplifying it. During the civil rights movement, it was similar. They would look at economic injustices at the corporate level, they'd study them, and then figure out what did that look like, for individuals and families in communities, Black communities, educate the people, and then get to the work of mobilizing, organizing and mobilizing and advocating.
All right, thank you. So I want to put two questions to you from the chat. One is from John. Is there a difference between injustice and unfairness as it relates to structural economic deprivation? And then the second is are there ways that programs like this, the Justice Dialogue or the partnerships, can help get more people involved in those types of things?
Absolutely. So the first, very good question, John. All of these questions are great. Is there a difference between injustice and unfairness? I find myself in this moment channeling my daughter, my 27-year-old daughter, who, she is like, so my grandfather, her grandfather, my father was he was a fearless fighter for the people, for justice. And in some ways, it may have skipped a generation. That fire. If you think you think I'm hot, woo, she's at a whole other level. And she often says, when I say to her, I talk about unjust capitalism. She says to me, "Is there just capitalism?" She pushes that back at me. If you think about the structure, how capitalism is structured, is it just? And so I'm reminded that when I look at, is there a difference between injustice and unfairness? I think it all comes down to, when I think about justice, I think about it as being like structurally stood up, that it is purposeful and intentional, right? Unfairness can be how sometimes things play out. But what we have to center on is whether it's by design, implementation, or impact. If the result is inequitable, something need be done about it. So we find sometimes that we stand up laws, we stand up policies, we stand up programs that can be unfair when they're actualized, when they're put into practice. The intent may not have been for it to be unfair. An example I'll give you very quickly. Some of you may have heard that in Evanston, Illinois, the local municipality determined to provide reparations for Black persons who had homes in Evanston, Illinois, that had been subjected to redlining with appraisal values that were significantly less than what the homes were actually worth, who had challenges obtaining low cost loans going back to the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. They determined to provide reparations to Black families who had homes in these particular communities at that time, both for purposes of buying new homes and for repairs for the homes that they were able to maintain. Just recently, a local court determined that the government's reparations program was unfair, was illegal, because there were plaintiffs who said that they were white. They lived in the community at the time as well, and they said that they were harmed by redlining. So the plan was to repair the harms to Black families in the community. But in some respects, they may be able to prove that it was unfair in its implementation. Because if I live in a community that overall has been redlined, and I'm a white person in that community owning a property, even though I'm not Black and the harm was not necessarily intended for me, I may have been harmed by it. So that's how I kind of distinguish between what is unfair and what may be unjust. Redlining was unjust. That was a law and a practice that was unjust. The result was unfair for the persons who it was intended to harm and may have actually harmed other people as well. Now, ways to get involved. So first and foremost, I encourage you all to go and check out FPWA's website, where we have a link to the True Cost of Living national campaign. Institutions like the Drum Major Institute, the Martin Luther King Families Institute, the National Urban League, the National Action Network, the Center for American Progress, Policy Link, and other institutions have joined the national campaign. Individuals, Dr. Barber is working with us on this national campaign. This is something that you can engage in. You can tell your local communities about this initiative. It's to effect a national true cost of living measure that, if we have it in place, gives us a true sense of what it costs to live, and then that can inform policies and programs, whether they be wage related or childcare, transportation, reducing debt, credit card debt, mortgage debt, and the like. So that's one way to get involved. Another way to get involved is, again, to begin with, thinking about, what do you see as unjust in your community? And then looking at what is the root cause of that. Not centering on a program or policy, simple small p policy, I call it Band-Aid response, but looking at, why does that injustice exist in the first place? Is it to perpetuate racial harm, gender harm? And then give me a call. I'm joking. You can call me. But working in groups to think about, well, how do we go about changing these systems and structures? But the first thing, most of all, is to understand that we're purposed to do this work, to find strength in being purposed to do it, that God desires this work. And then leaning in and beginning to look at things that in your community don't seem right. So I'll never forget, as a quick example, one day I was driving down the street and it was on a Saturday. And I saw this very, very, very long line. Turned the corner and saw that the line continued. And as I looked down the block, I saw that it wrapped around So it was actually like it was going around 3 blocks in New York City, like a U shape. It was a line for students and families desirous of attending one of the best high schools in New York City. It is unjust that we live in a city, that I live in a city, where you essentially are playing the lottery to get into a good high school, where we know from the mayor's chancellor's mouth about 10 years ago that he was not intent on creating a good school system, but rather a system with good schools. That what was meant by that was that he knew that not every child would have a quality education experience. Justice work is unpacking the root causes of that. And that's the work that we're doing right now. What are the laws that allow for a system with good schools only and not a good school system? How does the funding flow to uphold that and challenging that? So, I am always available, and I say that with the utmost sincerity. That even if it means we're talking at 6 a.m. in the morning, to help people think about when you do justice work, you have to do root cause analysis. Very often, what happens is you look at a problem. People who are good do-gooders, we look at a problem, and then we think, oh, we have a reactive response to the problem, but we don't look at what causes the problem in the first place. Think about when I was diagnosed with cancer, they could have treated the problem with chemo, but they had to understand why the cancer was present in my body in the first place. And the way that they could cure me and keep me in a state of being completely rid of the cancer was to go find that root cause, the broken system, and replace it. Justice work is replacing the systems.
Thank you so much for that and for this great presentation. There are questions or thoughts and comments in the chat, and we invite you to take those down. But before we end, I would like to invite Moye Harris, Director of Racial Justice at Sojourners, to speak into the room about some work that she and Sojourners are doing in advance of this election season.
First, I just want to say thank you, Miss Jones. Um, I I quote your father often, and when I'm talking about election work, how one's theology informs their anthropology, which informs their sociology. Just that notion of who people think and believe God is informs how they treat everyone.
Mhm.
I'm Reverend Moya Harris at Sojourners, and I just happened to get this in my inbox, and I'm just so glad I was able to come. But we're working with Face United to Save Democracy for the election season. We are recruiting faith leaders to become poll chaplains for voter protection, and we start our training for poll chaplains and faith peacekeepers next month. And we're really about honoring everyone's image of God so that they can get to the polls. And I look at it as how can we create communities that where everyone can thrive and voting being the tool to get us there.
Mhm.
So I just appreciate everything that you've said because it's all systematic. It's like we got to break down the systems.
Yes,
We can't just put a band-aid on it when somebody's having a heart attack.
that's
So
right.
yeah, I'm a nurse
May
too.
I just say I really appreciate your sharing your reflections and memories of my dad. I mean, that's it at the core, right?
Mhm.
What did he say? A simple surface diagnosis of the system um, reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology which emanates from a false theology.
Mhm.
How we see God, if we see God as white and male, then anthropologically, the white male is supreme because God is supreme. And then sociologically, we order our society accordingly, where
Mhm.
it is acceptable for white male to be on top and the polar opposite, black woman to be on the bottom, which is why even the most educated segment of our society, she's still paid 64 cents on the dollar for what a white man earns, and somehow it's okay.
Yeah.
The voting is so critical. Let me tell you what is as critical is that they stay engaged after the voting.
That part.
This is where we missed the mark. This
Mhm.
is where the justice work comes in.
Mhm.
If I put you in office, I'm expecting you to now do the justice work to upend the structures that perpetuate inequity.
Yep.
And
That's
what so often happens is we get engaged, our person gets elected, or our person doesn't get elected, and then we walk away. And then
exactly.
we look up and we're like, here we are again.
Exactly. I appreciate that. And we just today we had a meeting and we were talking about our goals for the next year. And part of my goals is building power through engaging people when we're not having elections. So that when the elections come, we can keep holding people accountable, but we vote for the people who have actually kept their word or haven't or get the other people out. Education throughout the whole time. So thank you. And
Excellent.
I'll put the website in the chat, but
Oh,
and Freddie Haynes is my classmate, so I am just delighted. So thank you.
he's a great guy. And I see Rebecca's with us. Rebecca and Cheryl were both so tremendous in bringing the book God in the Ghetto Prophetic Word revisited to fruition, bringing it back. And Dr. Frederick Haynes, in many ways, along with Dr. Hagray, inspired me to actually bring it back out. So I'm grateful for both of them. I thank you for this time, and if there's ever an opportunity for me to just share with you all, to work with you as you're doing this work, I'm at the ready, blessed and purposed to serve in this regard. And so, if I can ever be helpful, do not hesitate.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all for sharing this time with us. Um, I will ask our executive director, Dr. Hagray, if he will close us in prayer as we depart.
Sure. Thanks to everyone for participating today, and Jennifer Jones, Austin. We love you, and we appreciate you being part of us in this important work. To the God of justice, of love, strength, grace, and glory, we give thanks for our time together, and we pray for the wisdom, the strength that we all need to be change makers, peacemakers, and justice workers in our world in this day and time. If we ever needed justice workers before, we sure do need them now. So, God, give us the grace, the empowerment, and the Holy Spirit that we need to do what you've called us to do in such a time as this, we pray. Amen. Thank you all.